The disabled mother had lived a life marked by quiet resilience and unacknowledged sacrifice, her days passing in a blend of muted hope and persistent hardship. Her physical limitations, a consequence of an accident years ago, had transformed what was once a life filled with autonomy into one of dependency, yet she carried herself with dignity that few recognized or appreciated. She resided in the same home she had nurtured for decades, a house that was once a place of laughter and family gatherings where memories had been woven into every corner of the walls, floors, and furniture. Her son and his wife, however, had long grown indifferent to these memories, blinded by their material aspirations and the ever-present desire for wealth that had begun to dominate their lives in subtle but insidious ways. They viewed her as a burden rather than a parent, as an obstacle to their envisioned future, rather than a person deserving of care and respect. The decision to confine her in the dog shed was not made impulsively, but rather as the culmination of months of calculated thought, disguised under the pretense of care. They rationalized their actions with a narrative that suited their self-interest, convincing themselves that it was a temporary measure, that she would not mind, that it was for her own good. In reality, the shed was a grim enclosure, far removed from the comfort and warmth of the home she had once inhabited. Its walls were cold and uninviting, the floor rough and uneven, the space cramped, barely accommodating her modest frame and necessary mobility aids. The air inside often carried a musty, stale scent, lingering as a constant reminder of the neglect and disregard with which she was treated. Despite her physical constraints, the mother retained a sharp awareness of her surroundings, an acute perception of the dynamics that had led to her current state. She had noticed the subtle changes in her son's behavior over the years, the shifting tones in his voice, the furtive glances exchanged with his wife, the small but telling adjustments in household routines that seemed designed to minimize her presence rather than enhance her comfort. She understood that this confinement was the result of deliberate planning, that it was a manifestation of their greed, and yet she endured with a patience born of both necessity and a deep understanding of human nature. She knew that confrontation could provoke retaliation, that anger could lead to further isolation, and that inaction, though painful, might preserve opportunities for eventual justice or vindication. The shed itself became a symbol of her marginalization within the family, a physical embodiment of the emotional and psychological distance that had grown between her and her closest kin. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to her plight, while within the confined space her existence was reduced to the bare essentials of survival. Meals were brought irregularly, conversations limited to curt instructions or passing remarks, and the rituals of daily life were stripped of the dignity she had once enjoyed. Her only companions were the occasional passing birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the faint echoes of laughter from neighbors' homes, a reminder of the life she had been excluded from. Yet even in this harsh environment, the mother's mind remained active, resilient, and determined. She recalled the lessons of her earlier life, the knowledge she had accumulated over decades, and the network of acquaintances and friends who, unbeknownst to her son and his wife, had been subtly nurtured over the years. These connections, though dormant in daily interaction, represented an unseen web of potential influence, resources, and support that could, if leveraged wisely, alter the balance of power within the family. Her intelligence, her strategic thinking, and her ability to remain composed in adversity became her tools of silent resistance, her way of maintaining a sense of agency, despite the physical and emotional constraints imposed upon her. The psychological toll of her confinement was profound. Days stretched interminably, marked by repetitive routines and the monotony of a space that offered little sensory stimulation or engagement. Yet she sought small ways to preserve her mental and emotional well-being, arranging her limited possessions with care, keeping a private journal where she recorded observations and reflections, and meditating on memories of better times. These acts, seemingly minor, became acts of defiance, subtle affirmations of her identity and her refusal to be entirely defined by her circumstances. She was aware that her son and his wife underestimated her capacity for endurance, that they believed their actions could suppress her spirit, and she took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that they had misjudged her resilience. Interactions with her son and his wife, when they occurred, were marked by tension, veiled hostility, and a transactional quality that underscored the imbalance in power and affection. They spoke to her not as a mother deserving of respect, but as an inconvenience to be managed, their words often laced with impatience or thinly veiled disdain. The subtle cruelty of these exchanges left lasting impressions, not because they diminished her intrinsic worth, which remained intact, but because they revealed the depth of moral corruption that could manifest in the pursuit of self-interest. Her awareness of this hypocrisy fueled a quiet determination to endure, to observe, and to wait for a moment when circumstances might shift in her favor. Her isolation also provided her with unexpected clarity. In the quiet moments of the shed, she reflected on the dynamics of wealth, entitlement, and familial obligation. She considered the ways in which human behavior could be distorted by greed, and the consequences of valuing material gain over empathy, loyalty, and moral responsibility. These reflections, though prompted by suffering, enriched her understanding of human nature, sharpening her perception of motives, intentions, and vulnerabilities. She became attuned to subtle cues, the unsaid words, the fleeting expressions, and the inconsistencies in behavior that revealed more about her son and his wife than they realized themselves. The son and his wife had always assumed they knew the contours of their mother's life, the extent of her wealth, and the legacy that would eventually pass through the family. Their assumptions were built not on concrete knowledge but on a patchwork of casual observations, rumors, and their own fantasies of financial gain. They were convinced that the modest lifestyle she presented, the small house she lived in, the careful budgeting she adhered to, and the lack of ostentatious displays of wealth were indicative of a life constrained by circumstance, a life that offered nothing of real value to them. In their minds, the inheritance would be minimal, perhaps a few belongings or a modest sum of money, certainly nothing that could justify their ambitions or the lengths they were willing to go to secure it. They were completely unaware, utterly blind to the hidden reality of her financial empire, the complex web of investments, businesses, and holdings she had quietly nurtured over decades. To them, she was a woman whose physical limitations made her vulnerable, whose disability reduced her capacity to manage the family's affairs, and whose needs were simple and easily contained. They never suspected that behind her calm demeanor and subdued presence lay a strategic, intelligent mind capable of orchestrating vast financial enterprises, maintaining high-level connections, and ensuring the growth and preservation of her assets over time. Her outward simplicity was a deliberate choice, a shield she had cultivated to protect herself and her legacy from opportunistic family members and predatory acquaintances alike. Their ignorance of her true wealth was not born of negligence but of overconfidence. They believed that by controlling her immediate environment, by isolating her, dictating her routines, and limiting her social interactions, they could manipulate her decisions and secure any future inheritance that might come their way. They underestimated the subtlety and depth of her foresight, the long-term planning that had gone into building her fortune, and the protective measures she had established to ensure that her wealth would not fall prey to opportunism or reckless behavior. They saw only what was visible, only what reinforced their narrative of her as a vulnerable, dependent parent, and in doing so they blinded themselves to the truth that had been there all along. The reality of her hidden billionaire status was a story of decades of careful management, strategic investment, and prudent risk-taking. She had begun her journey with modest means, perhaps an inheritance of her own or small personal savings, and through sheer diligence, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to recognize opportunity, she had built a financial empire that spanned industries and continents. Her ventures were diverse, ranging from real estate and technology to boutique investments and charitable foundations, all meticulously documented and managed through a network of trusted advisors who understood both the sensitivity and the magnitude of her holdings. Yet she had deliberately kept this information from her family, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but as a safeguard against exactly the kind of greed and entitlement that her son and his wife were now exhibiting. Because of this hidden wealth, every action of the son and his wife was built on a flawed assumption, a house of cards constructed on ignorance. They plotted, schemed, and manipulated with confidence, never realizing that the foundation they relied upon was not only unstable but entirely invisible to them. Their plans to isolate their mother, to control her environment, and to ultimately inherit what they believed would be a modest sum, were in reality attempts to seize something they did not comprehend, something far beyond their imagination or moral capacity to handle. Each decision they made, every effort to assert dominance over her, was a step deeper into a scenario they were unprepared for, one that would reveal the vast gulf between perception and reality. The irony of their ignorance was compounded by the mother's own calm and composed behavior. She did not overtly flaunt her wealth, she did not boast or threaten, and she allowed her son and his wife to operate under the delusion that they were in control. This was not passive acceptance, but strategic patience. She observed, recorded, and mentally catalogued every action, every word, every inconsistency, and every indicator of intent. Her knowledge of their ignorance gave her power, a quiet authority that she could wield when the time was right. The very act of being underestimated became a tool, a mechanism through which she could plan her responses and protect both herself and her assets from those who sought to exploit them. Their lack of awareness also revealed deeper character flaws, the dimensions of greed, entitlement, and moral blindness that can manifest in close familial relationships. They assumed entitlement without evidence, acted with audacity without reflection, and judged without understanding. The mother's hidden billionaire status was, in a sense, a mirror that reflected not her own power but their own deficiencies. The ways in which human nature can distort perception, the ways in which desire can cloud judgment, and the ways in which assumptions can lead to disastrous miscalculations. They believed that money was the end goal, yet they could not even recognize it when it was right in front of them, demonstrating a profound disconnect between aspiration and comprehension. Even their daily interactions were shaped by this ignorance. When they spoke to her, it was with the confidence of assumed superiority, the presumption that she was dependent on them for her well-being, and that any resistance on her part could be easily managed. They controlled her environment, restricted her mobility, and imposed limitations, believing that these actions were sufficient to ensure their dominance. They had no conception of the resources at her disposal, the intricate financial networks she could access, or the strategic influence she wielded behind the scenes. In their minds, they were the architects of her life, when in truth they were merely temporary occupants in a scenario orchestrated on a scale they could not even fathom. The mother's invisibly vast fortune had implications that extended far beyond simple financial gain. It represented freedom, security, and influence, elements that the son and his wife had attempted to suppress but could not ultimately neutralize. Their unawareness meant that their entire strategy was based on faulty assumptions, and every effort to manipulate or control her only increased the eventual discrepancy between their perception and reality. In essence, they were navigating a landscape entirely constructed in their own minds, blind to the true contours of the terrain, and unaware that the very person they sought to dominate possessed the tools to alter every facet of their imagined control. The exploitation by the son and his wife was not simply a matter of convenience or impulsive cruelty. It was the culmination of deeply rooted entitlement, a calculated pursuit of inheritance that had, over time, transformed into a defining obsession. From the moment they began envisioning the wealth that could be theirs, their actions became increasingly strategic, meticulously orchestrated to isolate, control, and manipulate the disabled mother in ways that ensured her compliance, or at least her incapacity to resist. Their greed was not merely financial but psychological, seeking domination over both her assets and her agency, a desire to reshape family dynamics to suit their ambitions, while suppressing any challenge to their authority. They began subtly at first, rationalizing small acts of control as concern or as necessary management of her needs. Meal times were dictated, personal routines were interrupted, and daily activities were curtailed under the pretense of care. Each restriction was framed as protective, as though they were safeguarding her well-being, when in reality it was an incremental consolidation of power, each small act reinforcing their control and diminishing her autonomy. They told themselves that they were only enforcing structure, that she would eventually thank them for their vigilance. But beneath the surface was a relentless drive to position themselves as gatekeepers to her life and ultimately to her fortune. The dog shed, the physical space in which she was confined, became the most potent symbol of their exploitation. It represented not only their desire to marginalize her but also the psychological mechanisms by which they justified their actions. They convinced themselves that by isolating her they were simplifying her life, that she would be less vulnerable and less exposed to potential risks. Yet in truth, the shed was a prison of neglect, a manifestation of greed in its rawest form, an environment intentionally deprived of comfort, interaction, and dignity, designed to reduce her influence and maximize their perceived control. Each time they delivered a meal or a brief interaction, they treated it as a transactional exchange rather than an act of familial duty, a reflection of their commodification of her very existence. The son and his wife were careful to maintain appearances, particularly in social settings where neighbors or extended family might observe. Outwardly, they portrayed themselves as dutiful caretakers, attentive and compassionate, while privately their actions were guided by calculations aimed at exploiting her for personal gain. They monitored her movements, restricted her communications, and limited her access to friends and acquaintances, all the while rationalizing these behaviors as protection rather than suppression. This duality, the public facade of care contrasted with private exploitation, revealed not only their greed, but the moral contortions they had embraced to reconcile their self-image with their behavior. Inheritance greed in their case was not abstract or distant, it permeated every aspect of their lives. Conversations often revolved around imagined futures, the distribution of assets, and hypothetical scenarios in which they would assume control of the wealth. They debated strategies, assessed potential obstacles, and speculated about the mother's reactions, all without the slightest awareness of her hidden billionaire status. In their minds, she was a finite resource, her fortune modest and manageable, and they could bend circumstances to their favor. Their planning became obsessive, informed by the mistaken belief that foresight and cunning could guarantee control over a situation they fundamentally misunderstood. The exploitation was reinforced by the emotional dynamics of the household. The son and his wife leveraged guilt, obligation, and familial expectation as tools, framing their demands as necessary care and moral responsibility. They manipulated conversations to emphasize dependency, highlighted her physical limitations to justify restrictions, and crafted a narrative in which her compliance was assumed. They exploited social norms around filial duty, confident that others would interpret their actions as benevolent, while internally they pursued a more self-serving objective, the maximization of their prospective inheritance. This blend of emotional coercion and strategic calculation illustrated how greed can operate not only through material ambition but also through the distortion of relationships, ethics, and perception. The mother's disability amplified the effectiveness of their exploitation as it provided both a pretext and a practical means to assert dominance. Her reliance on others for mobility, communication, and basic needs made her vulnerable to manipulation, and the son and his wife recognized that these vulnerabilities could be instrumentalized. They structured their control to ensure that any act of defiance would be met with inconvenience, isolation, or withdrawal of support, subtly reinforcing the power imbalance. The dynamics were cyclical. Their attempts to extract control fueled further restrictions, which in turn deepened her dependency, creating a feedback loop in which exploitation became normalized, rationalized, and self-perpetuating. Yet beneath the surface of oppression, the mother retained awareness, resilience, and agency in ways they did not anticipate. Her intelligence and strategic thinking allowed her to recognize patterns, predict behaviors, and maintain an internal sense of autonomy even in the face of confinement. She documented events mentally and emotionally, cataloged conversations, and considered future courses of action that might counterbalance their manipulations. Her hidden wealth, though unknown to them, added a layer of potential leverage, a silent force that could undo their calculations if she chose to exercise it. The very act of being underestimated became a shield, transforming her supposed vulnerability into a form of latent power, one that the son and his wife could neither perceive nor counter. Greed, in their context, was not merely an emotional state but a lens through which all interactions were interpreted and justified. Each gesture, word, or omission by the mother was scrutinized for its potential to influence inheritance outcomes, rather than understood as expressions of need, personality, or familial bond. They read her behaviors selectively, emphasizing signs of compliance as proof of their efficacy, while dismissing indications of subtle resistance or strategic patience. Their moral framework was constructed entirely around self-interest, where empathy, respect, and recognition of her dignity were subordinated to the calculus of acquisition. This distortion allowed them to commit acts of neglect and confinement without apparent cognitive dissonance, believing that their actions were rational and deserved, even as they violated fundamental ethical and emotional obligations. The household became a microcosm of exploitation driven by inheritance greed, where the mother's well-being was subordinated to ambition, where relationships were transactional, and where ethical considerations were continually overridden by desire for material gain. They viewed her life as a resource to be mined, her body as a vessel whose limitations could be manipulated, and her existence as a stepping stone to their imagined future. Each restriction imposed, each conversation controlled, and each act of isolation was a deliberate strategy in the pursuit of wealth, revealing the depths to which human greed can infiltrate intimate relationships, erode empathy, and rationalize cruelty in the name of perceived entitlement. The revelation of the mother's hidden wealth was a moment that would alter the trajectory of every relationship within the household, though at first it was invisible to the very people whose lives it would most disrupt. The son and his wife, so consumed with the illusion of entitlement, were blind to the complex tapestry of financial, social, and strategic assets that their mother had cultivated over decades. They assumed that they were the architects of her life, that they could control her environment, manipulate her decisions, and secure whatever inheritance they imagined might come their way, never suspecting that the very foundation of their assumptions was fundamentally flawed. Their ignorance created a fragile narrative in which greed and ambition operated unchecked, and it was this fragility that set the stage for the dramatic twist that would ultimately upend their sense of certainty and control. The mother's wealth had not been accumulated haphazardly or by chance. It was the product of decades of strategic investment, careful risk management, and a profound understanding of human behavior and market dynamics. She had built businesses, acquired properties, invested in high-growth ventures, and established trusts and foundations that ensured her assets were protected and poised to expand even in her absence. She had maintained meticulous records, cultivated a network of trusted advisors, and designed a structure that safeguarded her wealth from opportunists, including those closest to her. The depth and scale of her fortune were such that casual observation would never reveal it. Her daily modesty and the simplicity of her life were deliberate, a protective cloak that hid immense financial power from prying eyes. The dramatic twist emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, as subtle inconsistencies in the household began to reveal themselves to the mother's son and wife. Small incidents, a bank statement left visible, an unexpected call from a financial advisor, a quiet reference to a trust or foundation, were dismissed at first as anomalies, minor details that did not contradict their assumptions. Yet, cumulatively, these hints began to erode the narrative they had constructed in their minds, planting seeds of confusion, curiosity, and eventually alarm. Each subtle sign of wealth was like a ripple in a pond, initially unnoticed but steadily expanding until it became impossible to ignore, revealing a reality that was dramatically at odds with their expectations. The mother's strategy was deliberate. She did not immediately confront their ignorance or reveal her fortune. Instead, she allowed their assumptions to guide their actions, observing the lengths to which greed had corrupted their behavior. She watched how they restricted her movements, dictated her daily life, and assumed authority over her decisions. She cataloged their words, gestures, and intentions, understanding that their overconfidence and moral blindness would be their own undoing. The hidden wealth was not merely an asset to be revealed, but a tool, a mechanism through which she could exert influence, protect herself, and teach them a lesson in humility, patience, and the consequences of underestimating others. When the revelation finally became undeniable, it transformed the household dynamics in profound and unpredictable ways. The son and his wife experienced a cascade of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, fear, and eventually desperation. Their mental models of reality, built on assumptions of control and entitlement, collapsed under the weight of the truth. They realized that every action taken to isolate and manipulate their mother had been predicated on ignorance, that their scheming had been futile, and that the very person they sought to dominate possessed resources far beyond their comprehension or moral capacity to manage. This realization did not simply expose the error of their assumptions, it shattered the psychological scaffolding upon which their sense of superiority had rested. The mother, in contrast, navigated this revelation with composed strategy. She did not seek vengeance in the traditional sense. Instead, she allowed the truth to unfold in ways that maximized its instructive power. Her awareness of their greed, ambition, and entitlement meant that she could anticipate reactions, manage potential conflicts, and deploy her influence in measured ways. The dramatic twist was not merely the disclosure of wealth, it was the exposure of a moral and psychological truth that the pursuit of inheritance untempered by empathy, wisdom, or awareness can blind individuals to reality and render them vulnerable to consequences far greater than they imagined. This revelation also had broader implications extending beyond the immediate household. The mother's fortune was entangled in networks of business partners, charitable organizations, and social initiatives that reflected her vision, values, and long-term planning. The son and his wife, once focused solely on immediate gain, now confronted the complexity and scale of her influence. They were forced to recognize that wealth is not merely a measure of currency, but of strategic foresight, relational networks, and the capacity to shape outcomes across domains. Their understanding of inheritance as a transactional exchange collapsed, replaced by the realization that true power, both financial and moral, had always resided in the mother they had sought to control. The psychological impact of the revelation on the son and his wife was profound. They oscillated between denial and acceptance, struggling to reconcile their previous assumptions with the newly unveiled reality. Their attempts to rationalize past behaviors, justifying greed, manipulation, and neglect, became increasingly untenable as the magnitude of her fortune and strategic foresight became undeniable. Each new piece of information about her wealth served as both a factual revelation and a moral indictment, exposing not only the depth of their misjudgment but also the ethical failings that had driven their exploitation. The mother's concealed wealth also transformed the dynamics of power and agency within the household. Whereas previously she had been perceived as dependent and constrained, the revelation inverted that perception. She was now the holder of ultimate authority, a force whose resources, knowledge, and strategic planning could override the control her son and his wife had sought to exert. Their actions, once assertive, became reactive. Their plans, once confident, became subject to her discretion. The hidden billionaire status was not simply a plot device, but a profound reconfiguration of relational and psychological hierarchies, demonstrating the intersection of wealth, power, and moral consequence in a deeply human context.